The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. So I'd like to share a story about a man named George, if I could, this morning. Is that all right? Okay. Honestly, I don't know what you do if you all tell me no. I didn't make it very far past that first line in Isaiah that says how to sustain a weary with a word without thinking of him. I first met George Milner when I moved to Pensacola back in 2017. George was what you might consider a regular at church. If there was an event at St. C's, like a concert, midweek manna, Bible study, or a healing service, you could count on George being there. Before George retired, he worked in television and radio, and it was said that he had one of those million-dollar voices. I can attest to that, and it went right along with the way that he made you feel when you were in his presence. Invariably, he'd end the conversation by looking straight at you and saying without hesitation, "Hey, I'm glad you're here." And he meant it. And after a few minutes with him, you were glad too. George was always a sharp-dressed man with starched slacks along with an Oxford shirt and a jacket. The guy had class. And to this day was one of the only men that I knew who wore boutonnieres for the hell of it and could pull off a bolo tie while everybody else was wearing seersucker. Took talent. He was a world traveler, a well-read gentleman, and he was a widower. If you worked in the office at church, you could count on old George popping in with a carnation or two when you really needed it. He had a sense about him that knew. And my favorite thing about George was his faithfulness. Every week, without fail, George would arrive in the morning, stop in and say hello, and then make his way to the memorial garden and place a single flower on the resting place of his beloved. Every week, without fail, whether we had a hurricane or not. In between those moments, Mr. Milner was instrumental in establishing a survivors of suicide support group and a Compassionate Friends local chapter. He served on the board of directors of Widowed Persons Service Corps and trained volunteers for them. He co-founded and facilitated a community law support group for approximately 15 years, and at 40 years my senior, he seemed to know what I was thinking before I would think it, and he listened anyways. And because he listened so much, you might say that George was a man of few words. But even so, when he did speak, they were the right words. And that skill doesn't come easy. It comes with helping people bear their crosses, even while he was carrying his own. That was just George. And I suspect you know some folks like that too. One of the hardest things I've had to do was watch his decline over the last year of his life. Whether that was driving him home in between services because he had become incontinent, or catching him before he fell out of the lectern because his blood pressure was dangerously low. Me and George kind of got to know each other rather well. And God help you if you called an ambulance. God help you. And yet, in the aftermath of all the messes and the falls, George would often survey the wreckage and be able to reassure you somehow that despite all of our sensibilities, what we were witnessing in those moments was the byproduct of being human. And George was one of the most human people that I've ever known. You'll remember when the pandemic began, yes? How communities struggled to sort of maintain contact with one another, right? No more meetings, no more concerts, and the great push to offer everything electronic, right? I think we are continuing to deal with the after effects even now, both the wonderful strides that has made and the challenging aspect of bringing folks back home in the wake of new Sunday traditions, but I digress. The Monday after one of our first Sundays back, I received a message from the Publix floral department asking if I could give Gina a call. And the ticket had George's name in brackets on it. I called Gina and learned she would usually assist George in picking out flowers to take to the memorial garden. But she hadn't seen George in a few weeks and called the church to check on him. Susie and I love folks like Gina, right? Call the church if you know something's happening. As it happens, George's absence wasn't necessarily due to the pandemic, but rather was because of a serious diagnosis that necessitated hospice. In a matter of days, George went from sitting in an easy chair to the bed, and we kept vigil. Because George kept his condition to himself, his caregivers and a few friends were given the task of connecting with family members near and far. And in a matter of hours, miraculously, flights were booked and people were on their way, save one, George's daughter. Try as she might, she couldn't get out as fast as the others could, and in a desperate attempt to stay the inevitable, we held up the phone to George's ear. George gritted his teeth in that moment. And as she spoke, I looked at the hospice nurse, and then she looked it back to me and she said, "You know what, honey, it's okay. I thought George was in pain." But she knew something else. What I was seeing on George's face in that moment was pure determination. George made the decision to wait, you see. And in the end, I've often wondered about how powerful our agency is in those moments, those final moments, because whatever was said to him over that phone, whatever was said to him that he heard, that sustained George. It gave him enough strength to wait another day, and wait he did. George died peacefully with his daughter at his side the following day. I've often wondered what was said on that phone call the day before George passed away, and it just so happens that I got my chance at the funeral for George last July. In an offering of thanksgiving, and I want you to hear that, in an offering of thanksgiving, George's daughter recounted what she said. She told him, "I'm coming home, Daddy. Wait for me. I'm on my way. I'm coming home to you." And it strikes me so powerfully now when I'm called to help folks say their last goodbyes that I've come to realize that it's not so much a word that sustains the weary, but love. The words are different for all of us. And if we haven't spoken them yet, we've heard them. And they go something like this. I love you, Mom. You keep fighting. Wait, Daddy. I'm on my way. I'm here. I'm home. I love you. Go. We'll be all right. Words of love strengthen the weary. We know them just as we know that we should listen more than we should speak. We know them, though we all have our crosses to bear. And that much depends on who Jesus is to us. And the only thing I think we can give in return for our lives is our witness. And with respect to George, his witness lives on. As the guests began to leave the memorial garden, I turned back to get the ossuary, and there alone was a woman in a public's uniform. It was Gina. She had 2 carnations with her. I waved to her, and she placed the flowers on George's grave and then came and thanked me for letting her know about the service. And, I thanked her for letting me know about George. And as I walked her to her car, she told me that George bought flowers from her every week for over 10 years. And that she didn't know just how much she would miss him. But one thing she did know was that from then on, she would not forget him. And more profoundly, that she would bring a flower for him each week. I've been told since that she hasn't missed an appointment.